At the start of the Civil War, thousands of young men thought they were marching toward glory. What they found instead was mud, hunger, and disease. In camp after camp, the real threat was not always the enemy across the field. It was the water they drank, the food they ate, and the infections that spread faster than bullets ever could. Dysentery, fever, starvation, and exhaustion killed soldiers by the tens of thousands. And disease killed more soldiers than battle did. So, what was the Civil War really like for the average soldier? Not the version you see in monuments and textbooks. The real story was much harsher. Filthy camps, terrible rations, collapsing bodies, and a medical system that often could not save the men it was trying to treat. When Americans think about the Civil War, they usually picture the famous battles: Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, or Cold Harbor. They picture smoke, cannon fire, officers shouting orders, and soldiers charging forward under flags. But that is only a small part of the story. For most soldiers, the war was not a few dramatic moments on a battlefield. It was a long, grinding struggle to survive each day in camp. They lived in crowded conditions, slept in tents or rough shelters, marched for miles with heavy gear, and spent hours exposed to rain, heat, mud, and cold. Most of their time was spent in camp, not in combat. That matters because the real war was often fought in the places history books skip over. Every day began with the same basic question: what will I eat? And is it safe to drink the water? The answer was usually disappointing. Union soldiers were often issued hardtack, salted meat, coffee, sugar, and salt. Confederate soldiers, especially later in the war, often had even less. Food shortages became severe. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare. Meat was often heavily salted or spoiled. Bread could be stale or missing altogether. Men lost weight quickly, and under those conditions, the body becomes weaker, slower, and far more vulnerable to disease. That mattered because the Civil War was not only a military conflict, it was also a public health disaster. Mass armies create dangerous conditions when they are packed together without modern sanitation. Soldiers dug latrines near camp. Waste piled up. Water sources became contaminated. Garbage and human waste could sit close to where men cooked, washed, and drank. In many camps, the same water that kept a man alive could also make him sick. Poor shelter, unhealthy food, and a lack of hygiene created waves of sickness and disease. This was not a rare problem. It was everyday life. Hunger did more than make soldiers miserable. It made them easier to break. A man who is underfed loses strength fast. He gets tired sooner. He heals slower. He becomes more likely to catch whatever is spreading through camp. And in the Civil War, there was a lot spreading. The diet itself was part of the problem. Soldiers relied heavily on preserved food, and when supplies broke down, the quality dropped fast. Fresh produce was limited, and that meant the body was missing things it needed to stay strong. Even when soldiers had enough calories to survive, they were often not getting enough variety or nutrition to stay healthy over time. That created a deadly chain reaction. Bad food weakened the body. Weak bodies got sick more easily. Sick soldiers could not march or fight. And once illness entered a camp, it spread fast. Among the most feared illnesses of the war was dysentery. Dysentery is a severe intestinal infection that causes diarrhea, cramps, fever, and dehydration. In the 1860s, soldiers had no antibiotics, no intravenous fluids, and no real understanding of how infections spread. They did not know how quickly contaminated water or filthy conditions could move through an entire camp. Once dysentery took hold, it could break a man down fast. A soldier might begin with stomach pain and weakness. Then came the diarrhea, then dehydration, then exhaustion so severe that he could no longer march, stand, or fight. In some cases, the illness became fatal. In others, it left a man too weak to recover fully. Dysentery was not just miserable, it was disabling and often deadly. And dysentery was only one part of the problem. Typhoid fever, diarrhea, measles, malaria, pneumonia, and other diseases moved through the armies as well. The war created the perfect conditions for infection. Large groups of men, poor food, contaminated water, limited medical knowledge, and no reliable system to prevent outbreaks. In that environment, illness spread with devastating speed. This is one of the clearest truths about the Civil War. Disease killed more soldiers than battle did. That fact changes the way we should understand the war. The battles were terrifying, but they were not the only killers. A soldier could survive enemy fire and still die in camp from infection. He could survive a march and collapse from dehydration. He could survive one illness only to catch another in an overcrowded hospital. For many men, the war was a slow physical breakdown, not one sudden dramatic moment. The numbers are staggering. The Civil War caused around 620,000 deaths, and about 2/3 of those deaths came from disease rather than combat. The Union Army alone recorded more than 1.6 million cases of diarrhea and dysentery, which shows just how overwhelming illness became inside military camps. But numbers alone do not fully capture what that meant on the ground. Imagine a camp where men are already weak from hunger. Imagine dirty water, overcrowded tents, rain-soaked clothing, and no real way to keep waste away from living space. Imagine a soldier trying to sleep while the man next to him is vomiting, feverish, or rushing outside with dysentery. That was not an exception. That was ordinary wartime life for many soldiers. And when men were wounded or fell ill, the medical system was often overwhelmed. Civil War medicine was limited, brutal, and improvised. Surgeons worked with too few supplies and too many patients. Field hospitals were crowded. Clean instruments and clean hands were not yet standard practice. Amputation became common because it was often the quickest way to deal with a shattered limb or severe infection. Sometimes it saved lives. Sometimes it simply delayed death. Infections after surgery were common. Shock was common. Blood loss was common. A soldier who survived the battlefield could still die later in a hospital tent, not from the original wound itself, but from the complications that followed. That is why the war's hidden suffering matters so much. The Civil War was not only fought with rifles and cannon, it was also fought inside the body, where hunger weakened resistance, dirty water spread infection, and disease hollowed out armies from within. Men did not only die in famous battles, they died in camps, on hospital cots, and along long roads where they had simply run out of strength. And that suffering had real consequences for the war itself. Armies weakened by illness could not fight at full strength. Soldiers who were underfed and exhausted marched more slowly, recovered more slowly, and broke down more easily. Disease was not just a tragic side effect of war, it was one of the forces that shaped the war's outcome. A healthy army is a stronger army. In the Civil War, both sides were constantly fighting to keep their men healthy enough to keep fighting at all. For many soldiers, the hardest part was not the battle they expected. It was the reality they never imagined. They enlisted thinking of honor, duty, or survival. What they found was a world of mud, hunger, disease, and constant vulnerability. They learned that war does not only kill through gunfire, it kills through neglect, contamination, exhaustion, and the breakdown of the human body. That is the side of the Civil War most people never see. Not the flags, not the speeches, not the clean, heroic version in old paintings. The real Civil War was dirty, hungry, sick, and often unbearable. If you want to understand the Civil War honestly, you have to look beyond the battlefield, because for many soldiers, the deadliest enemy was never the one they could see.